what Harry revealed by that is a complete lack of any self-awareness,
Hmm.
of any understanding of reality. He just behaved as the arrogant royal. The real problem for Meghan and Harry is they've got nothing to offer other than their victimhood and the story they've now told.
Welcome back. Today's episode is built around one of the most revealing conversations I have come across in a long time. An interview with Tom Bower, the investigative journalist and author behind Betrayal, Power, Deceit, and the Fight for the Future of the Royal Family. This is a man who spent years going through hours of footage, documents, and first-hand accounts to build a forensic picture of who Harry and Meghan actually are. Not the version they present, but the version visible in unguarded moments, in the videos, and in the small details that nobody else bothered to study, the details that accumulate into a very clear portrait. Who is Tom Bower begins there, with the idea that what matters is not the polished image, but the evidence left behind in conduct, reaction, and pattern. From that point, the conversation turns to Colombia. The Sussex visit to Colombia was publicly framed as a humanitarian trip, centered on female empowerment and advocacy, using the usual language attached to such appearances. But according to Bower's reporting, what it actually was a chaotic, poorly received, and financially embarrassing visit that Colombia's vice president came to deeply regret. The vice president had expected the Sussexes to contribute significantly to her charitable causes. The amount they reportedly left behind was around $8,000.
Well, the whole of the Colombian trip is actually shrouded in unbelievable mystery and secrecy. Not least because the vice president, a controversial woman, didn't want it to be known that in the end, the Sussexes, who she thought would contribute hugely to her charities, I think it left around about $8,000 behind.
For context, the trip involved private jets, multiple costume changes per day, 4 or 5 by Bower's count, and constant links directing people to purchase whatever Meghan was wearing, with commissions going back to her. Meghan's Campaign Explained presents the visit not as a straightforward act of service, but as something tightly connected to presentation, exposure, and monetization. The movement, the wardrobe changes, and the purchase links all pointed in the same direction. Instead of the focus remaining on the host country, the causes, or the people the trip was supposed to serve, attention was repeatedly pulled back toward Meghan's image, style, and visibility. The structure of the visit, as described here, made the trip look less like a mission of contribution and more like a carefully staged public campaign in which appearances and commercial benefit traveled alongside the language of activism.
It was a hugely controversial visit. Meghan used it to promote her fashion lines. She changed clothes at least 4 or 5 times a day, and there was always a link how to buy the accessory or the dress or whatever, on which she would get a commission.
So the financial flow of the trip was essentially from the host country toward Meghan rather than in the other direction. Nobody could establish with certainty who paid for the trip. What emerged through a leak from the vice president's office was that the Soros Foundation, a George Soros-linked charity operating in Colombia, had funded the private jet. The Soros Foundation declined to confirm or deny this, but given that the vice president had no private jet of her own and the Sussexes were not flying commercial, the connection was difficult to dismiss. The speeches Meghan gave on that trip are also worth examining on their own terms. She stood in front of rooms full of children who did not have reliable access to food and told them to pursue joy. That contrast sits at the center of the criticism in Bower's account. The setting was one of visible need and hardship, but the message delivered from the stage seemed detached from the immediate reality of the people listening. Instead of meeting that reality directly, the speech offered language that sounded polished and aspirational, but disconnected from the conditions in front of her. In that sense, the trip began to look not only financially unbalanced, but emotionally and socially misjudged as well.
Meghan speaks about female empowerment and how the Colombian women had to rise up. And next to her was the vice president, a woman who had come from the most impoverished background imaginable. The videos, which I've listed in the book, are just extraordinary when he is eating meals or standing at receptions where he really didn't understand what was happening because he doesn't speak a word of Spanish.
The lack of substance. There's a lack of substance when it comes to Meghan.
She also delivered lengthy tributes to her daughter Liette. She spoke about female empowerment to a room that included the vice president herself, a woman who had risen from genuine poverty to the second highest office in the country, apparently without registering the irony of an extremely wealthy American woman explaining female empowerment to her. The evidence against Meghan shifts the focus toward how these moments reveal the wider pattern Bauer sees. Harry, meanwhile, was visibly at sea. He does not speak Spanish. He sat through meals and stood at receptions looking, as Bauer puts it, more unhappy than he has ever appeared on camera. The smile was there, but behind it, after hours of footage reviewed by Bauer, there was complete emptiness. This matters because it points towards something central in how this partnership actually functions. Bauer's book documents a consistent pattern in how Meghan manages Harry in public. When Harry is about to say something she considers inadequate or simply embarrassing, she stops him. A hand on the arm, a sharp look, and he falls silent. She takes over. The significance of that pattern lies not only in the interruption itself, but in what it suggests about the balance between them whenever they appear together. The control of the exchange, the redirection of attention, and the quick intervention all become part of a repeated public rhythm.
Those moments ourselves with our own eyes. She does silence him in a way and then takes over the room.
The most striking example Bauer details happened at a mental health conference in New York. The entire conference was focused on the harm caused by unregulated social media, particularly to children. An eminent participant asked Harry directly, "What's your solution?" His answer was, "I don't know." This happened at a conference he co-hosted on a subject he had publicly championed in front of an audience of experts. Meghan stepped in to rescue the moment, but the damage had already been done, or rather, the reality had been exposed. The exchange stripped away the surrounding language and left only the gap between public advocacy and actual substance. Harry had been placed at the center of a subject he was meant to represent with seriousness and authority, yet when asked for an answer, he had nothing to offer. Meghan's intervention prevented the moment from continuing, but it did not erase what had already happened. Instead, it became another example of the same pattern Bauer keeps identifying, a pattern in which Harry reaches the point where he must speak for himself, falters, and is then overtaken before the weakness can widen any further.
Well, I mean, that's the problem. He has very limited intellect. He's out of his depth. And Meghan is intelligent. She knows exactly what she's trying to do and what she's trying to promote, and doesn't want Harry making a mess of it, which he invariably does.
Catherine's response moves from that incident toward Bauer's broader assessment of Harry. At a conference built around his supposed expertise and advocacy, Harry had nothing to offer. Bauer is blunt about this. In his assessment, Harry has a limited intellect and limited depth of argument. Meghan, by contrast, is intelligent, knows exactly what she is trying to do, and does not want Harry derailing it, which he consistently does when left to speak freely. That, in Bauer's view, is the reason for the intervention. It is not malicious control for its own sake. It is damage limitation. But the consequence of that dynamic, repeated in public over years, is the picture of a man who has no independent voice in his own marriage and career. A man who is managed rather than partnered with, and who, based on the footage Bauer has studied, looks increasingly like someone who knows it. The point is not simply that Meghan speaks more or steps in more quickly. The point is that the public image formed by these repeated moments is of a relationship in which one person directs, corrects, and contains, while the other becomes quieter, less assured, and more visibly displaced inside his own role. Over time, that leaves behind not the appearance of shared purpose, but the appearance of one person steering and another being carried along, even while cameras continue to record the performance of unity.
She manipulated the hostility between herself and Harry and the father, and it quite shocked the royal family and the members of the establishment. There was no doubt in their mind before the marriage that it was not going to continue for long in Britain.
Yeah, I mean...
Now let's talk about the car chase, because this is presented as one of the most egregious examples in the book of Harry and Meghan constructing a false narrative and then trying to use legal mechanisms to enforce it. Their account of the New York car chase, described as a near-catastrophic pursuit by paparazzi, was, according to Bauer's investigation, almost entirely fabricated. They claimed to have gone to a police precinct, filed a complaint, and received police protection back to their residence in Upper Manhattan. The police at that precinct denied all of it. They said Harry and Meghan had not entered the building, no complaint had been filed, no protection had been provided, and there had been no danger. What Harry then attempted to do, and this is the part given special attention, was to have the New York photographers prosecuted in California, not in New York where the alleged incident occurred, but in California. The attempt failed, but the intent is presented as revealing. This was not described as someone responding to a genuine threat. It was described as someone trying to use legal power to punish people for witnessing an event and reporting on it. The discussion then shifts to Harry's efforts to secure state finance protection when he visited Britain, whether by himself or with his family. In the end, the judge rejected his application. He lost the case. It cost him a great deal of money, and he is appealing again because he needs the state protection since he cannot afford it himself when he comes.
Getting state-financed protection when he visited Britain by himself or with his family. And of course, in the end, the judge rejected his application. He lost the case. It cost him a lot of money. And he's again appealing now because he needs the state protection because he can't afford it when he comes. Meghan, before she gets married, meets a very, very famous, important member of the British establishment. And that person is brought in every 3 to 4 weeks to Kensington Palace to tell Meghan about what her duties will be and how her life will follow her marriage to Harry, a part of the royal family. And that person very quickly discovered that Meghan was not going to obey any rules, she had no intention of staying, and that she was going to be a huge problem.
Within that context, the car chase is described as something manufactured as a narrative asset, something designed to generate sympathy, international headlines, and, crucially, to influence a judge in London who was hearing a separate case involving Harry. That is the context Bauer provides. The chase was not framed simply as a lie, but as a strategic lie deployed at a specific moment for a specific purpose. The pattern, as it is described, repeats across multiple incidents. Bauer's book goes deeply into the 40 car chase claim, which he systematically dismantles, and into the broader structure of how Harry and Meghan have approached their public narrative. Every grievance, every accusation, every dramatic claim of persecution is presented as having served a function. Before she married, Meghan met a very famous and important member of the British establishment. That person was brought in every 3 to 4 weeks to Kensington Palace to explain to Meghan what her duties would be and how her life would proceed after her marriage to Harry as part of the royal family. According to this account, that person quickly discovered that Meghan was not going to obey any rules, that she had no intention of staying, and that she was going to be a huge problem. The point made here is that the details, when examined carefully, too often do not hold up. The question of what happened to Meghan's famous network of powerful allies is addressed directly. Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, Stacey Abrams, and the roster of prominent women who were publicly associated with or sympathetic to Meghan in the early years of her post-royal life have gone quiet. Bauer's explanation is simple. People at that level of public life are constantly assessing social and political risk. The moment Meghan's brand carried more liability than benefit, the moment associating with her became more of a problem than an asset, they moved on. They did not issue dramatic statements. They simply stopped returning calls, stopped accepting lunches, and quietly disentangled themselves. Bauer describes a period when Meghan's team would arrange lunches at visible Montecito restaurants with carefully selected famous guests, engineered encounters intended to produce photographs and press mentions that would make her appear relevant. That, according to this account, has essentially stopped because there are no longer famous people willing to be recruited for it. The comparison to Andrew and Fergie is addressed carefully. A direct equivalence is resisted. Andrew and Fergie, in Bauer's view, were neither intelligent nor self-aware, and their failures were different in character from what is happening with Harry and Meghan. But the desperation is described as having a familiar quality, the sense of a couple who built their public existence on a kind of royal adjacency and are now watching that adjacency evaporate, while finding there is nothing underneath it to fall back on. The core of Bauer's argument is that Harry and Meghan can only sustain public interest by continuing to damage the royal family. Harry used the book not only to unload himself and seek huge damage against his family, but also because he misunderstood his own background. He misunderstood himself. What people forget, this account says, is that the book was originally going to come out in the Queen's lifetime, so he had absolutely no hesitation about burning his bridges there. He clearly felt he was going to attack his grandmother too. Their relevance is described as parasitic on the institution they left. Every interview, every book, every Netflix project, every dramatic claim has drawn from the same source, the story of their departure, and everything they say happened before and after it. That story has now been told multiple times in multiple formats, and it is running out of new material. Meanwhile, the royal family has moved on. The institution has absorbed the damage, stabilized under William's careful management, and continued. William and Catherine are presented as representing a version of the monarchy that is dignified, functional, and genuinely popular. The contrast with Harry and Meghan is described as not merely stylistic, but substantive. One couple has built something. The other has spent 5 years tearing something down and has discovered that demolition is not a sustainable career. The text then states that Meghan believed that she, rather than Kate, should be the next queen after Charles. She could not understand why she should not be queen, considering herself better looking, more intelligent, and harder working, and she hated the idea. Bauer ends this part of his analysis with a question he admits he cannot answer. How does this end? What is the explosion at the bottom of the spiral? He describes a car crash that is coming, though its route cannot be predicted. What is clear in his view is that the trajectory is sharply downward. The options are narrowing. The money will eventually run out. The lifestyle, the houses, the staff, the private travel, and the security all require an income that is becoming increasingly difficult to generate. Meghan, he notes, will go to Australia next month and present herself as Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex, a title she was expressly forbidden from using in that context by the late Queen. She will keep pushing because she has to, because the alternative is to stop. And stopping would mean acknowledging that it is over. That is the portrait Tom Bauer has drawn. A man who is lost and knows it, paired with a woman who is fighting with everything she has and slowly running out of road. It is described as a story that began with a genuine romance and a real desire for something different and has ended, or is ending, in a kind of gilded, sunlit desperation. It is called a moral story. You can have glory for 5 minutes, but when the flame goes out, you are in serious trouble. And the flame, in this account, is going out for Harry and Meghan. Let me go deeper on a few of these threads because they deserve more than a surface reading. Start with the Colombia trip and what it reveals about how Meghan thinks about her own role in the world. She went to Colombia, a country with genuine and serious inequality, with children living in poverty, with communities that have been through decades of violence and instability, and she treated it as a content opportunity. There were 4 or 5 outfit changes a day, each attached to a purchase link. There were speeches about joy and female empowerment that read as if they had been written for a completely different audience. There was an appearance at Cartagena that by multiple accounts felt more like a fashion shoot than a humanitarian visit. This is not presented as someone who went to Colombia to help. It is presented as someone who went to Colombia to be seen helping, and that is a fundamentally different thing. The difference matters because the people of Colombia, the vice president who hosted them, the organizations that expected meaningful contributions, and the ordinary citizens who lined up to see them were not props in a content strategy. They were people, and throughout the trip they were treated as though their primary function was to make Meghan look good. The figure that keeps returning is $8,000. The vice president organized the visit expecting a meaningful charitable contribution and got $8,000. For comparison, the clothes Meghan wore during the trip would have cost more than that. The private jet would have cost vastly more than that. The entire exercise, framed as advocacy and carried out as a public relations operation, left $8,000 behind. That is described not as philanthropy, but as the performance of philanthropy, which is something entirely different and considerably worse. The discussion then turns to Harry specifically and makes a point of separating what is happening with Harry from what is happening with Meghan, even though the two stories remain deeply intertwined. What Harry revealed, according to this account, was a complete lack of self-awareness and any understanding of reality. He behaved as the arrogant royal. In Bauer's assessment, Harry is a man of limited intellectual depth who is genuinely out of his depth in almost every professional context he places himself in. The mental health conference in New York is presented as the clearest example. Asked directly for a solution on the very issue around which he had built his post-royal advocacy, he answered, "I don't know." But this is not described as an isolated incident. It is presented as part of a pattern, visible across years of public appearances, speeches, and interviews. What Harry does have, or once had more strongly before the last few years wore it down, is charm, a kind of easy warmth that worked particularly well with veterans, with children, and with people who were not looking for intellectual depth, but for genuine human connection. Invictus succeeded not because Harry was a policy expert or strategic thinker, but because he showed up and cared, and the veterans could tell he cared. That is described as real, and it is said to matter, but then the argument shifts again, saying that Meghan turned Invictus into something else. Bauer's reporting on the Invictus Games in Vancouver is described as detailed and damning. She dominated the event by her performance. She used it to assert herself, to generate content, and to be visible. The event that Harry had built around service and genuine competition was repurposed as a backdrop for the Meghan Markle show. The veterans who competed, the people Invictus was actually built for, became supporting cast in someone else's narrative. At the same time, Bauer is careful to say that this does not diminish what Invictus does for the injured servicemen who compete. Those athletes, those families, and those stories of recovery and resilience are all described as real, valuable, and deserving of support. But the version of Invictus that Harry and Meghan have presented to the world, the red carpet version, the Netflix version, the Meghan in a hat looking concerned version, is described as something different. The gap between the two versions has grown wider with every passing year. The question of Harry's happiness is addressed not through one dramatic allegation, but through footage. Bauer spent hours watching videos from Colombia, Nigeria, Invictus, New York, and other public appearances, and what he observed is described as consistent across all of them. Harry is not happy. The smile does not reach his eyes. At meals, at receptions, and at public events, there is said to be a vacancy behind the performance, the presence of a man who is physically there but somewhere else entirely in any meaningful sense. One of the most telling details in this account is the body language seen in Jordan. There were multiple instances caught on camera of Harry physically evading Meghan's touch, pulling away and creating distance. The management dynamic, her hand on his arm, her intervention when he is about to speak, her physical repositioning of him has been visible for years. What is described as new and more recent footage is his resistance to it. Not dramatic resistance, not open confrontation, but something visible. A man quietly pulling back. That matters because the entire Sussex brand is built on the love story. They are described as desperate now, with no real interest in them anymore. The one great hope they had was that Meghan's Domestic Goddess series on Netflix would be a great success. Harry left everything, his family, his country, his role, and his purpose for Meghan. That was the narrative they sold, and it became the foundation on which the Netflix deals, the book deals, the Spotify deals, and everything else was built. If the love story fractures, the brand fractures with it. There is nothing underneath it to support it. Bauer's view is that the trajectory is now sharply and irreversibly downward. When the argument is followed through, it becomes difficult to locate a counter case. The money problem is described as real. Their lifestyle, and especially the security costs alone, are staggering. Running into millions per year, that lifestyle requires a level of income that is becoming increasingly difficult to justify. Netflix has stepped back. Spotify is gone. The book has already been published and absorbed. The documentary has already been made. The Oprah interview is years old. What remains? What is the next revenue source large enough to sustain this life? Australia is mentioned as a possibility, but even before it begins, the Australia trip is already generating resistance. The petition, the condemnation of its signatories, the $3,000 retreat. These are not described as the building blocks of a successful reinvention. In Harry's case, the line is drawn that he does not read books, but he did read his own book because he recorded the audio version. The various brand maneuvers are presented as the actions of a project in difficulty, trying to locate any revenue stream that still works. The As Ever lifestyle brand is described as another attempt. But the trademark filings in the United Kingdom, which mirror almost item for item what King Charles already sells through his charitable ventures, are presented as suggesting either a lack of original thinking or a deliberate provocation. Neither is said to read well. Even the taste test comparisons between Meghan's fruit spread and Charles's jam, which Charles has won handily, are presented as the kind of detail that stays in people's minds. Bauer's point about the royal family's survival instinct is important here. The institution has been dealing with crises, even existential ones, for centuries. It absorbed the abdication of Edward VII. It absorbed Diana. It will absorb Harry and Meghan. The difference is that the institution has resources, patience, and time on its side. Harry and Meghan have an expensive lifestyle and a narrowing set of options. William is described here as the key figure in that contrast. He has been methodical, disciplined, and unwavering. He has not engaged publicly. He has not answered provocations. He has simply continued to do the work, showing up, representing the institution, and building public trust while allowing the Sussex narrative to exhaust itself. That strategy is described as working. The contrast between William's consistent dignity and the Sussex chaos has done more to rehabilitate the monarchy's reputation than any formal public relations campaign could have done. What Bauer describes in the end is a story about the limits of self-invention. Meghan arrived in the royal family with enormous skill at constructing and managing a public persona. She knew how to present herself, how to generate the right kind of attention, and how to leverage a platform. Those skills are described as real. But what neither she nor Harry accounted for was that self-invention requires something genuine underneath it. A real product, a real skill, or a real service. When the royal connection was the foundation and they walked away from it, they discovered that what remained underneath was much thinner than they had believed. Press releases and lifestyle brands and retreat weekends do not replace 700 years of institutional history, and the attempt to substitute them has only made that gap more visible. The car crash, as Bauer says, is coming. The exact route is unknown, but the direction is clear. One final thread is the Hillary Clinton meeting and the wider question of what happened to Meghan's network of famous allies. Bauer describes a meeting between Meghan and Hillary Clinton that was warm, sympathetic, and politically useful for both sides at the time. Clinton was someone whose support conferred legitimacy, a signal that serious political figures took Meghan seriously as a voice and a possible player. Michelle Obama, Stacey Abrams, and other powerful women in American public life were also part of that moment. Not long ago, being associated with Meghan seemed like a reasonable bet. That moment is over. The way it ended is described as revealing. There was no dramatic falling out, no public statement, no formal distancing. People at that level do not announce that they are ending these associations. They simply stop being available. The lunches stop, the calls go unanswered, the connection quietly disappears. Bauer's explanation is blunt. People in positions of real power are always evaluating risk. When Meghan's brand began to carry more liability than benefit, when the Sussex name became associated more with controversy and failure than glamour and advocacy, the calculation changed. Powerful people moved on to more useful associations. What remains of Meghan's social world is described in similar terms. There were manufactured lunch parties in Mantedo, staged gatherings in visible restaurants with carefully selected celebrity guests designed to produce photographs and media coverage and preserve the appearance of relevance. That has largely stopped. The famous people of Mantedo have understood the dynamic. Proximity to Meghan brings a type of attention many of them do not want. The photographers, the commentary, and the drama make the association costly. People who live there have often learned how to remain famous without becoming tabloid fodder. Meghan, in this account, has not learned that, and spending time with her means being drawn into the tabloid orbit she inhabits. Oprah, who lives nearby, has gone quiet on the subject of Meghan in a way that is said to speak volumes. Ellen DeGeneres, who also lived in the area for some time, had her own issues but was never visibly part of the Sussex social circle. The wealthy and discreet people of Mantedo have, collectively, made a judgment that the downside of friendship outweighs the upside, that isolation, social, professional, and geographic becomes the context for everything else. The brand launches, the trademark filings, and the Australia retreats are not being carried out from a position of strength. They are being carried out by a couple who are increasingly alone, increasingly aware that their options are narrowing, and increasingly unable to admit it to themselves or to each other. Bauer's book is called Betrayal, and the betrayals he documents are multiple, of the royal family, of staff, of colleagues, of allies, and of the truth. But there is another betrayal in the story, the betrayal of Harry by his own choices. He is described as the man who left everything in pursuit of a life that turned out to be something other than advertised, who gave up belonging for freedom and discovered that the freedom was less satisfying than the belonging, who is now in Mantedo, estranged from his family, watching the institution he left continue without him, and being managed through whatever the marriage has become. That story does not yet have a clean ending because it has not ended yet, but Bauer's conclusion remains the same. A crash is coming. The trajectory is clear, even if the landing point is not. What is certain is that the institution will survive. The monarchy has been here before and has come through. William and Catherine are building something durable. The line of succession is healthy, and whatever Harry and Meghan do next, Australia, trademarks, films, retreats, it will be received by a public that has largely made up its mind.